Have you ever been locked out by the very person who taught you how to pray? Imagine standing in the freezing, torrential rain, running for your life from an empire that wants to destroy your faith, only to find the heavy iron door of your sanctuary securely bolted from the inside, locked by your own spiritual father. In the dark winter of the year 303, the Roman Empire unleashed a terrifying wave of persecution against the early Christians. But for a young, devoted believer named Valerius, the deepest, most devastating wound didn't come from the sharp edge of a Roman sword. It came from a sacred betrayal. We are often taught that when people we deeply respect walk out of our lives or forcefully push us away, it is because we are flawed, prideful, or unworthy. We internalize the rejection as our own spiritual failure. But what if that agonizing rejection is actually a divine rescue? What if God is forcibly removing a trusted mentor from your path because he sees a dark, hidden compromise that you cannot see? Today, we journey back to the underground house churches of ancient Rome to uncover a story of broken vessels, hidden ledgers, and the breathtaking realization that God's closed doors are sometimes his fiercest form of protection. The cold courtyard stones of the underground house church were slick with freezing rain, reflecting the bleak, fractured sky above. It was the winter of the year 303, the terrifying dawn of the great persecution under Emperor Diocletian. Lying entirely alone on the bottom step of the sanctuary was a simple wooden communion cup. It was cracked completely down the middle, its sacred purpose violently interrupted. A single, dark drop of sacramental wine, resembling a bead of fresh blood, clung stubbornly to the splintered rim. The heavy, iron-bound wooden doors of the sanctuary were sealed tight. Standing in the freezing downpour, a young, devoted catechist named Valerius stared at the broken vessel. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. Valerius shivered violently, though not entirely from the biting chill of the Roman winter. A profound, unsettling, and unnatural quiet had descended upon the Domus Ecclesiae, the secret, subterranean gathering place that had been his entire spiritual universe since the day of his baptism. For years, this hidden courtyard had echoed with the quiet murmurs of urgent prayer, the shuffling feet of the faithful seeking refuge, and the warm, authoritative voice of Bishop Severus. Severus was the man who had brought Valerius out of the pagan darkness, the man who had taught him the sacred scriptures, and the man who had served as his unerring spiritual father. But tonight, the courtyard felt like a graveyard of shadows, utterly devoid of the Holy Spirit's comforting warmth. Valerius stepped closer to the heavy wooden doors, his leather sandals slipping on the wet, moss-covered stone. He reached out a trembling hand to knock, desperately needing the comfort of his community. But he hesitated. He felt a deep, instinctive dread, a warning whispered in the very marrow of his bones. Through the narrow slit of the upper balcony window, a thick, woven curtain was drawn almost completely shut. But it was not entirely sealed. Valerius could see the faint, nervous, and erratic flickering of candlelight emanating from the bishop's private quarters. He called out, his voice a desperate, raspy whisper that barely carried over the sound of the torrential rain. "Father Severus, it is Valerius. The streets are not safe tonight. The Emperor's wolves are out. Please, let me in." The heavy curtain twitched. A servant, a man Valerius had broken bread with just weeks prior. A man he had prayed beside peered down through the narrow gap. The servant's eyes were wide, darting left and right in the darkness, filled with an unmistakable, suffocating terror. He looked directly at Valerius, who stood vulnerable and exposed in the open courtyard. And then, with a terrifying, calculated slowness, the servant pulled the curtain tightly shut. The light vanished. The silence that followed was deafening. It was not the gentle silence of a household resting in the peace of Christ. It was the breathless, agonizing silence of a house that was hiding a terrible secret. Valerius backed away, his heart pounding a frantic, bruised rhythm against his ribs. A deep, paralyzing discomfort settled heavily in his chest. Why was he being locked out? He was the bishop's most devoted student. He had spent countless nights by candlelight, meticulously transcribing the very scrolls of the Gospels that were currently hidden beneath the sanctuary altar. As he stood trembling in the freezing rain, a sudden, rhythmic, metallic clinking echoed from the main cobblestone thoroughfare just beyond the courtyard walls. Roman legionaries. It was a heavy night patrol, heavily armed, their pitch-soaked torches hissing aggressively in the downpour. Valerius pressed his back tightly against the cold, rough stone wall of the courtyard, holding his breath, praying for the earth to swallow him. He waited for the inevitable, for the soldiers to break down the iron gates of the sanctuary. The edicts of Diocletian had commanded that all Christian scriptures be dragged into the public squares and burned, and that all places of worship be dismantled stone by stone. He braced himself for the screams of his brethren, ready to rush from the shadows to his bishop's defense, entirely willing to embrace the crown of martyrdom beside the man he loved like a father. But the heavy, rhythmic footsteps marched right past the gates. The soldiers did not stop. They did not slow down. They did not even cast a passing glance at the known Christian stronghold. They moved on with the casual, terrifying indifference of men who already knew perfectly well that there was nothing left to conquer behind those walls. A chilling wave of absolute dread washed over Valerius, freezing him from the inside out. The sanctuary was completely safe from the Romans, but it was inexplicably barred to him. According to the historical memory of the early church during this brutal era, the most devastating wounds were rarely inflicted by the sharp edge of Roman swords. They were inflicted by the sudden, unexplainable severing of sacred ties. Standing alone in the dark, Valerius looked down at the cracked communion cup at his feet. The community was fractured. His spiritual father had vanished behind a locked door, and an unbearable, haunting question began to take root in his mind. Had God abandoned him? Or had the man who represented God suddenly, secretly turned into a stranger? To understand the agonizing sting of this locked door, one must look back to the weeks leading up to the emperor's deadly decrees. The exclusion of Valerius did not happen in a single, violent rupture that could be easily identified and fought against. It was a slow, agonizing fade, an orchestrated, silent erasure that left Valerius questioning his own sanity, his own worth, and the very foundation of his faith. It began not with a shouted argument or a public trial, but with the quiet, scratching sound of a quill on parchment. Just a month prior, the underground congregation had gathered in the dim, flickering light of the cellar for the reading of the Psalms. Valerius, holding the honored position of lector, stood near the simple stone altar. His voice trembled with reverent passion as he read the ancient, echoing promises of God's deliverance from Psalm 27. The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The people in the cellar were terrified. Whispers of the coming persecution had already swept through the bustling markets of Rome like a plague. Valerius sought to encourage them, to remind them that the blood of the martyrs was the seed of the church, and that Christ would never abandon his flock. But as he read the sacred text, he felt a heavy, oppressive, almost suffocating gaze upon him. Bishop Severus sat in the high wooden chair of the presider, cloaked in his heavy vestments, his face entirely unreadable. He did not look at the congregation. He stared intently, almost obsessively, at the thick, leather-bound ledger resting on his lap. This book contained the names of the church's leaders, the servers, the deacons, and the lectors. It was the registry of the faithful. Slowly, with a chilling calmness, Severus dipped his quill into an inkwell, without looking up, without a single word of explanation. He drew a thick, black line directly through Valerius's name. When the gathering concluded and the people began to quietly disperse into the night, Severus motioned for Valerius to step down from the altar. In front of the remaining elders and deacons, the bishop's voice was clipped, cold, and dripping with a subtle, paternal disappointment that cut deeper than any knife. "You are relieved of your duties, Valerius," Severus said softly, his tone perfectly modulated to ensure the others could hear his supposed pastoral concern. "Your prayers are too loud for these sensitive times. Your zeal is reckless. You draw the eyes of the wolves directly to the sheepfold." Valerius was utterly stunned. The breath left his lungs. He looked at the faces of the older men, seeking a sympathetic eye, a gesture of support. But they all looked away, trusting implicitly in the wisdom of their bishop. "But Father," Valerius stammered, his cheeks burning with the intense heat of public humiliation, "I only speak the words of the scripture. We must stand firm. We must comfort the brethren." "You speak from pride," Severus interrupted, his tone sharpening instantly into a weapon of spiritual manipulation. "You suffer from the deep, blinding arrogance of youth. You wish to be a martyr for your own glory, to hear your name sung in the catacombs, not for the genuine love of the brethren. Until you learn quiet obedience, until you humble yourself, you will not serve at this altar. You will not read the scrolls. You are dismissed." The words struck Valerius like a physical blow to the chest. He did not feel a spark of anger toward his mentor. Instead, he felt a crushing, devastating wave of guilt. This was the first false explanation, the agonizing, mistaken belief that would torment him relentlessly for weeks. Valerius, like so many sincere believers who face spiritual abuse, internalized the rejection completely. He convinced himself that Severus, with his profound spiritual insight, had seen a dark, hidden, rotting flaw in his soul that Valerius himself was blind to. He believed his passionate love for God was actually a toxic, selfish ambition. He walked away from the altar that night carrying a heavy burden of shame, weeping in the dark, believing he was a literal danger to the very people he loved. Over the next several weeks, the micro-exclusions multiplied like a spreading infection. When Valerius approached the bishop to seek spiritual counsel, to confess his supposed pride and ask for guidance, Severus would suddenly find himself too busy, physically turning his back to speak with the wealthy merchants of the congregation. When Valerius offered to help hide the sacred texts, the most dangerous and vital task in the church, as the Roman noose tightened, he was coldly told that his hands were not steady enough for the work, that he could not be trusted with the holy things. Yet, there were strange inconsistencies that Valerius's guilt-ridden, grieving mind struggled to process. Severus's hands were the ones visibly shaking when he handled the church records. The bishop had ordered new, heavy iron locks installed on the archive doors. but he kept the singular key entirely to himself, refusing to let even the oldest, most trusted deacons access the scriptures. The atmosphere of the church was rapidly changing from a sanctuary of vibrant faith and mutual comfort into a fortress of suffocating paranoia and suspicion. Valerius doubled his efforts to be good. He fasted for days. He prayed in the freezing rain. He sought to violently purify his heart of this supposed pride. He desperately, achingly wanted to win back the approving smile of his spiritual father. He failed to see the terrifying truth. Severus was not pushing him away because Valerius was deeply flawed. Severus was pushing him away because Valerius was dangerously faithful. The young man was crying out in genuine repentance for a sin he did not commit, begging for the affection of a shepherd who was quietly, methodically preparing to slaughter the sheep. The spiritual wound inside Valerius deepened into a profound, suffocating loneliness, a void that seemed impossible to fill. There is no isolation quite as agonizing, no grief quite as piercing, as being abandoned by the very person who introduced you to the divine. For Valerius, Bishop Severus was not merely a teacher of theology. He was the earthly anchor of his heavenly faith. He was the voice that had pronounced him forgiven, the hands that had pulled him from the baptismal waters. To be casually discarded by him felt entirely synonymous with being discarded by God himself. Every closed door, every averted gaze, every cold silence from the bishop felt like a divine verdict of eternal condemnation. Desperation finally overrode his assigned obedience. It was late in the evening, the air thick with the smell of approaching rain and the distant, acrid smoke of Roman watchfires that dotted the city's hills. Valerius decided he could no longer live in this torturous spiritual exile. He would go to the bishop's private residence, fall to his knees in the dirt, and beg for absolution. He would promise whatever silence, whatever strict conformity Severus required, just to belong to the fold once again. He needed to be heard. He needed to be forgiven. He approached the rear entrance of the bishop's grand estate, moving quietly like a ghost through the shadows of the ancient olive trees. As he neared the heavy oak door, he stopped dead in his tracks. The door was slightly ajar, spilling a thin, sharp sliver of torchlight into the dark garden. From within the room, Valerius heard the unmistakable, heavy, metallic clinking of coins. He leaned closer, holding his breath, peering through the narrow crack. Bishop Severus was not kneeling in prayer for his persecuted flock. He was standing beside his grand, polished wooden desk, wrapped in his finest, most expensive clerical garments. Across from him stood a man wearing the unmistakable crimson and gold tunic of a Roman provincial magistrate. Valerius's breath caught sharply in his throat. The magistrate was smiling, a thin, bureaucratic, bloodless smile devoid of outward malice, but full of dark, transactionnelle satisfaction. In the center of the desk sat a heavy leather pouch, bulging with Roman denarii. Next to it lay a stack of parchment. It was the church's registry. It was the very ledger Severus had used to cross out Valerius's name weeks ago. "You have chosen wisely, Severus," the magistrate said, his voice smooth, practical, and entirely devoid of conscience. "The emperor requires only obedience, not unnecessary bloodshed when cooperation is offered. The structures will be spared. Your personal estates and wealth will remain completely untouched. But the texts must burn in the square tomorrow. And the leaders of your little sect must be made an example of to satisfy the edict. The texts are already gathered in the archives." Severus replied. His voice did not tremble. It was terrifyingly calm. stripped of all its usual pastoral warmth, sounding exactly like a merchant negotiating the price of grain. The key will be left in the door for your men. As for the most devout among them, the elders, the deacons, they will gather here tomorrow night for the great vigil. You will have no trouble finding them. They trust this house. Valerius felt his knees buckle beneath him. A cold, nauseating sweat broke out across his skin. This was not a nightmare. This was history unfolding in its darkest, most tragic form. The intimate spiritual wound he suffered in that garden was apocalyptic. The man who had baptized him in the name of the eternal, self-sacrificing truth was casually, methodically selling the lives of his brothers and sisters to protect his earthly wealth and physical safety. In his utter shock and horror, Valerius stumbled backward. His heel caught on an exposed root, and his sandal snapped a dry olive branch. The loud, sharp crack echoed like a gunshot in the quiet, tense night. Inside the room, the voices instantly stopped. The silence was absolute. A moment later, the heavy door was violently thrown open, and Severus stood in the frame, his eyes wide with a frantic mixture of raw terror and furious, desperate rage. He looked out into the garden and saw Valerius trembling in the shadows. For one fleeting, tragic second, Valerius saw the raw, naked guilt on his mentor's face, but it was immediately, aggressively swallowed by a fierce, defensive hostility. Valerius opened his mouth, trying to find words, trying to ask if what he had just heard was a cruel illusion. "Father," he whispered, hot tears streaming down his face, his voice breaking with the weight of a shattered world. Severus stepped aggressively into the garden, grabbing Valerius by the rough fabric of his tunic. His grip was surprisingly strong, fueled by the panic of a cornered animal. He pulled the young man close, his breath smelling heavily of expensive wine. The micro-humiliation that followed was a silent, violent erasure of everything they had ever shared. "You foolish, wretched child," Severus hissed, his voice trembling with pure venom, ensuring the magistrate inside could not hear the panic. "You understand nothing of the world. You understand nothing of survival. The church must endure, and it needs buildings. It needs resources. The brethren." Valerius choked out, tears mixing with the rain on his cheeks. "You are giving them the brethren. You are giving them the word. I am saving what can be saved." Severus shoved him backward with all his might, sending Valerius crashing hard into the wet dirt. The bishop towered over him, his massive silhouette completely blocking out the moonlight. "You are a disease to this church, Valerius, a fanatic who will get us all killed. I command you, by the sacred authority vested in me, to leave this city tonight. If you return to this property, if you speak a single word to anyone in the congregation, I will personally hand you over to the prefect's guards before sunrise. You are dead to this church." Severus turned, walked back inside, and slammed the door shut, throwing the iron bolt. Valerius lay in the wet, freezing dirt, his world entirely, irreparably shattered. The hidden truth was bleeding out into the open, but the agonizing price of knowing it was the total destruction of his spiritual home. Theology reminds us that God sometimes allows the idols of our hearts to violently fall, stripping away every human crutch, so that we might realize our faith must rest solely, completely on Christ. But in that agonizing moment, Valerius did not feel divine protection. He felt only the crushing suffocating weight of a sacred betrayal. He needed to be comforted, to be guided. But instead, he was left broken in the mud. The following night, the heavy sky over Rome bled with the sinister orange glow of distant fires. The edict of Diocletian had moved from a bureaucratic decree to a brutal, systematic execution. Across the ancient city, doors were being violently smashed in. Sacred scrolls, the very words of life, were dragged into the cobblestone streets and set ablaze, their ashes swirling into the night sky. The faithful were being dragged from their beds, chained together like animals, and marched toward the damp pleth, disease-ridden prisons. The air was thick with the smell of burning parchment and the devastating sound of weeping. This was the midpoint point of no return. The fragile, beautiful illusion of safety that the Christian community had meticulously built over decades was being violently dismantled in a single night. Valerius had not fled the city, despite the bishop's terrifying threat, despite his own devastating, paralyzing heartbreak. He could not bring himself to abandon the flock. He had spent the entire day hiding in the darkest recesses of the catacombs among the tombs of the martyrs, wrestling with a maddening, agonizing spiritual paralysis. Who could he possibly warn if he ran to the elders and told them that their beloved, venerated bishop was a traitor who had sold them for silver? They would call him a bitter, jealous liar. Severus had already masterfully laid the groundwork for this, publicly branding Valerius as a resentful, prideful fanatic. The proof of the betrayal, the ledger, the leather pouch of Roman coins, was securely locked away in the bishop's quarters. The system of injustice was seamlessly sealed, but as the sound of Roman patrols drew closer to his district, an overwhelming, sacrificial love overrode Valerius's paralysis. He knew the congregation was gathering at the Domus Ecclesiae for the night vigil. Trusting implicitly in the bishop's assurance that their sanctuary was heavily protected by the grace of God, they were walking blindly, faithfully, directly into a slaughterhouse. Valerius ran through the labyrinth of narrow back alleys, his lungs burning, his muscles screaming. The freezing rain masked the hot tears pouring down his face. He had to warn them. He had to drag them out of the house by force before the magistrate arrived. He rounded the final stone corner and sprinted frantically into the courtyard of the bishop's estate. It was terrifyingly quiet. The heavy, iron-bound wooden doors of the sanctuary were completely shut. Above the door, the massive iron keyhole gleamed faintly. Menacingly, in the dark, Valerius threw his entire body weight against the thick wood, but it did not yield a fraction of an inch. The massive iron bolts had been thrown from the inside. He hammered his fists against the thick oak, his knuckles instantly splitting and bleeding against the rough, unforgiving grain. "Open," he screamed, his voice tearing, echoing off the stone walls. "It's a trap, brothers. Sisters, you must flee in the name of Christ. Open the door." He pressed his ear flat against the freezing wood, desperately expecting to hear the frantic whispers of the congregation, the scrambling of feet, the sudden realization of danger. Instead, he heard something that froze the blood in his veins, stopping his heart. The unmistakable, rhythmic creak of Roman leather armor, the heavy, metallic shifting of legionaries' swords being drawn from their scabbards. They were already inside. The sheep had not gathered in the sanctuary to pray. They had been herded directly into the waiting hands of the wolves. Suddenly, the small, iron-grated viewing window in the center of the heavy door slid open with a harsh, grating scrape of metal. Valerius gasped and stepped back, his chest heaving. Looking through the iron bars was not a Roman soldier. It was Bishop Severus. The physical proximity was absolutely agonizing. Valerius stood outside in the freezing downpour, his face bruised, wet, and bleeding. Trembling with absolute terror for the innocent people trapped inside, Severus stood in the dry, dimly lit, comfortable warmth of the foyer. The mentor and the student stared at each other through the iron bars. The proof of the betrayal was no longer hidden in a garden. It was right here, etched deeply into the bishop's hollow. Cowardly, dead eyes. This was the ultimate intimate wound. Valerius looked deeply at the man who had poured the waters of baptism over his head, the man who had taught him the meaning of grace. He looked desperately for a trace of remorse, a hint of the Holy Spirit, a flicker of the courageous shepherd who had once promised to lay down his life for the sheep. There was nothing. The light had completely gone out. There was only the cold, calculating, reptilian instinct of self-preservation. "Father," Valerius whispered, his voice cracking. A final, pitiful, broken plea not for himself, but for the man's eternal soul. "What have you done to them?" Severus did not answer. He did not blink. With a terrifying, steady, unfeeling hand, the bishop reached up and slid the iron grate shut. Clack. Then came the heavy, undeniable, fatal sound of the main iron bolt sliding firmly into place, locking the door permanently from the inside. Valerius fell to his knees in the freezing, muddy puddles of the courtyard. The physical door had been shut, but the spiritual door had been utterly obliterated. The abandonment was total, consuming, and absolute. He was an orphan in the most profound, agonizing sense of the word, left outside in the cold, exposed to the roaming Roman patrols, denied the glory of standing with his brethren in their darkest hour, and rejected by his spiritual father. He was entirely, devastatingly alone. As the sound of marching boots approached the courtyard gates, Valerius pushed himself up from the mud. With the church turned into a prison, he had nowhere left to go but the terrifying, uncharted wilderness beyond the city walls. He ran into the darkness, carrying the unbearable weight of a survivor who believes he has been left behind by both man and God. Weeks bled into months. The great persecution raged like an uncontrollable wildfire across the Roman Empire, leaving only ashes, broken bodies, and martyrs in its wake. Valerius lived in the harsh, unforgiving, rocky wilderness outside the city limits, seeking refuge deep within the damp limestone caves where the earliest Christians had once hidden. He was physically starved, his garments reduced to filthy rags. But his spiritual starvation was far more excruciating. He spent his long, freezing nights staring into the dying embers of small fires, tormented by the vivid, looping memory of the heavy iron bolt sliding shut. He firmly believed he was a castaway. He believed his exclusion was a permanent mark of profound shame. He mourned the loss of his vibrant community, but mostly, he mourned the agonizing loss of his bishop. The silence of institutional neglect weighed far heavier on his soul than any Roman chains ever could. He prayed the psalms of lament, crying out, "Me God, why have you forsaken me?" Then, on a bitterly cold morning, the agonizing silence was finally broken. A small, ragged group of wounded refugees stumbled blindly into the cave system. They were survivors, those who had managed to miraculously escape the city's holding cells before the public executions began. Among them was an elderly deacon named Lucius, a man whose back bore the fresh, brutal, weeping scars of Roman scourging. When Lucius saw Valerius standing quietly in the shadows of the cave, the old man's eyes widened, and he collapsed to his knees on the stone floor, weeping uncontrollably. Valerius rushed forward to help him up, his heart breaking, expecting the deacon to recoil from him, expecting to be cursed as the fanatic who was exiled before the fire. Instead, Lucius gripped Valerius's forearms with trembling, scarred hands. "You are alive," the old man sobbed, his tears falling onto Valerius's wrists. "Praise be to Christ. The bishop did not drag you down into the pit with the rest of us." Valerius froze, his mind struggling to comprehend the words. "What are you saying?" "Lucius, the bishop. Severus expelled me. He locked me out in the rain. He told the Romans I was dead to the church." Lucius reached into his tattered, filthy cloak and pulled out a crumpled, blood-stained parchment. It was a copy of a Roman magistrate's edict, a document that had been secretly smuggled out of the praetorium by a sympathetic guard. It was a public record, a libellus documenting the property transfers and official actions of the state. "This is the terrible cost of our shepherd's fear," Lucius whispered, his voice trembling with a potent mixture of sacred anger and profound, exhausting grief. "We have the list. Valerius. The list of the traditores, those who handed over the sacred scriptures to be burned, and those who handed over the brethren to the sword." Valerius took the parchment with shaking hands. There, bearing the official, undeniable wax seal of the Roman governor, was the public revelation of the hidden truth. It recorded in stark, bureaucratic Latin that Bishop Severus had formally surrendered the archives of the church and provided the magistrates with a comprehensive, detailed list of the congregation's most devout members. In exchange for this betrayal, Severus was granted full amnesty and permanent ownership of the vast estate that had once been the church's sanctuary. But it was the second piece of parchment Lucius held that turned Valerius's entire world upside down. It was an exact copy of the actual list Severus had given to the Romans. The names of the condemned. Valerius scanned the list, his heart hammered wildly against his ribs. He read the names of the elders who had stood with him, the widows he had fed, the deacons he had served beside. He reached the very bottom of the scroll. His name was not there. "He did not include me?" Valerius asked, his voice barely a whisper, his mind struggling to bridge the massive discrepancy. If Severus hated him so much, if he was such a threat, why not hand him over to be executed with the rest? "Don't you see?" Valerius Lucius said gently, his eyes filling with a sudden, reverent, breathtaking awe. "Your name wasn't on the Roman list because he had already struck your name from the church's ledger weeks before. He didn't lock you out of the sanctuary that night to punish you. God blinded him. God forced him to cast you out because the sanctuary had already been sold as a slaughterhouse." The revelation hit Valerius with the staggering force of a physical blow. The entire narrative of his suffering inverted in a single, blinding, holy flash of spiritual clarity. The very things he had wept over in the dark, the public humiliation, the removal from the altar, the harsh accusations of pride, the brutal banishment into the freezing rain were not acts of divine punishment. They were acts of divine severance. God had not allowed his mentor to cast him out because Valerius was unworthy or sinful. God had utilized the mentor's cowardly rejection to surgically extract Valerius from the trap, Precisely because the mentor's heart was already secretly corrupted, Valerius had spent weeks weeping bitterly over a locked door, failing completely to realize that the building inside was on fire. We must be careful not to judge too hastily those who broke under unimaginable Roman cruelty. History records that many good men faltered when faced with the horrific instruments of torture. But theology also demands that we recognize the staggering, surgical precision of God's providence. Valerius's greatest pain was, in reality, his greatest rescue. The public confrontation was not Valerius angrily destroying the bishop. It was the silent truth of history, exposing the cowardice of the institution, while simultaneously vindicating the quiet faith of the outcast. The silence and fear of Severus cost him his soul and his legacy. But his cowardly rejection became the very instrument of God's profound protection over Valerius's life. The healing of a deep, sacred wound does not come from watching your enemies suffer, nor does it come from demanding a bitter revenge. True divine justice is morally symmetrical. It restores exactly what was taken away, but in a pure air, untainted, heavily refined form. Valerius had lost his dignity, his sense of belonging, and the spiritual father he had deeply trusted. What he received in the cold, rocky wilderness was the staggering restoration of his true calling. As quiet word spread through the underground networks that Valerius had survived completely untouched by the devastating compromises of the traditores, more and more refugees began to find their way to the limestone caves. They came broken, terrified, bleeding, and deeply suspicious of any human authority. They had learned the hard, agonizing way that a man wearing the beautiful robes of a bishop could still harbor the treacherous heart of Judas. They needed to be listened to. They needed to be comforted. They needed to know they still had value in the eyes of God. Valerius did not demand their submission. He did not build a wooden throne in the caves to replace the one Severus had lost. He simply sat in the dirt beside them. He gently bandaged their physical wounds. He shared his meager rations. And from the deep, undisturbed well of his memory, he recited the scriptures that the Romans had burned. He became the gentle, unwavering shepherd he had once so desperately needed. His faith had shifted fundamentally. The training wheels of institutional dependency had been violently, painfully ripped away. But he was finally riding free. He realized that his spiritual authority did not come from the approval of a compromised mentor. It came directly from Christ. The agonizing realization that God had removed Severus from his life to protect him filled Valerius with a profound, unshakable, deeply comforting peace. He no longer felt a shred of anger toward the bishop. He felt a deep, sorrowful pity for a man who had traded an eternal crown for a few years of comfort in a decaying, dying empire. Years later, the brutal fires of the Diocletianic persecution finally burned out. A new emperor rose to power, and Christianity was eventually legalized. Valerius, now a hardened, deeply revered, and battle-scarred elder of the faith, walked quietly back into the city of Rome. He did not return to the city to reclaim stolen property, to demand an official title, or to seek public praise. He walked directly to the site of the old Domus Ecclesiae. The Roman magistrates, true to the fleeting, treacherous nature of earthly alliances, had eventually betrayed Severus. Once the bishop was no longer useful to them, his estate had been brutally seized, plundered of its wealth, and burned to the ground. Severus had died in quiet exile, stripped of his earthly comforts and his heavenly flock, remembered by history only as a traditor, one who handed over the sacred things. Valerius stood in the silent rata and the silent, overgrown ruins of the courtyard, the cold stone steps, where he had once wept in the rain, were covered in soot and wild vines. He knelt quietly by the ashes of the heavy wooden door that had once been slammed in his face. There, half buried in the blackened dirt, was the massive iron key. It was the absolute symbol of Severus's earthly control, the tool he had used to lock the flock in and lock the faithful out. It was rusted, entirely useless, and fused permanently to the burned wood. Valerius did not pick it up. He looked at it with a profound sense of closure, and he left it in the ashes where it belonged. Sometimes, God allows our hearts to be profoundly broken by the very people we trust the most. He permits the sudden, painful, unexplainable end of relationships, ministries, and mentorships. In the moment, it feels like a devastating loss of dignity and belonging, a complete spiritual orphanhood. But as later, Christian memory lovingly preserves, God is uniquely capable of seeing the spiritual decay that is hidden behind a pious smile. He removes them, not because you have failed, not because your prayers are too loud or your faith too flawed, but because their heart is secretly against the beautiful purpose He has for you. His closed doors are rarely rejections. They are His fiercest, most loving form of protection. Valerius stood up, turning his back on the ruins of the compromised institution forever. The final, resonant image of his journey was not one of lingering bitterness or cheap, earthly vindication. Later that evening, deep within the absolute safety of the limestone caves, surrounded by a thriving, vibrant, unbroken community of believers who loved him, Valerius knelt at a simple stone slab. There were no golden chalices, no heavy ledgers of exclusion, no locked doors. He reached out and struck a flint. A single, bright candle flared to life in the darkness, beautifully illuminating the faces of a pure, untainted flock. The false father was gone, but the true light remained, burning brighter, warmer, and freer than it ever could have within the walls of a locked room. The tragedy of the traditores, the leaders who handed over the sacred texts and their brethren during the Diocletianic persecution, is one of the most painful and complex chapters in early Christian history. But the story of Valerius offers a profound, mature lens through which we can view our own modern experiences of spiritual betrayal, institutional failure, and the devastating loss of community when a mentor falls, or a trusted religious institution closes its doors on us. Our immediate, agonizing instinct is to internalize the rejection. We wonder what we did wrong to lose their grace, and by extension, God's grace. Yet, history and theology remind us that human frailty is never a reflection of God's character. Sometimes, the crushing loss of a spiritual father or a sacred space is not a punishment, but a surgical act of divine mercy. God will occasionally allow our human idols to violently crumble so that our faith is not built on the fragile, shifting sands of human charisma, but on the unshakable bedrock of Christ alone. This story also challenges us to view the betrayer not merely as a cartoonish monster, but with a mournful, sober pity. Bishop Severus traded his eternal legacy for a few fleeting years of earthly comfort. Breaking under the unimaginable terror of Rome, it forces us to examine our own hearts. What subtle compromises are we making today for the sake of societal approval or physical security? Valerius's journey from devastating rejection to quiet, empowered leadership in the wilderness teaches us that our dignity, our worth, and our spiritual calling are never dependent on a human endorsement. When the institution fails, the true light remains. We learn that true justice is not found in seeking revenge against those who hurt us, but in breaking the cycle, healing the wounded, and carrying the uncompromised truth forward into the dark. If Valerius's journey through the wilderness resonated with you today, please consider liking this video, sharing it with someone who might be silently healing from their own spiritual wounds, and subscribing to the channel. Your support is what allows us to continue bringing these forgotten, sacred histories to light. I would love to hear from you in the comments below. Have you ever experienced a painful rejection, a broken relationship, or a closed door in your life, only to look back years later and realize it was actually God's protection? How did you find your peace and regain your faith after that separation? Let's build a community of encouragement and grace down there. And please make sure your notification bell is turned on. In our next video, we will journey into the searing heat of the Egyptian desert to uncover the mystery of a wealthy, ancient noblewoman who abandoned her vast fortune overnight, leaving behind a cryptic, sacred message that scholars are still trying to decode today. You won't want to miss it.